Hello, everyone. This is going to be the English 1 Standard Student Study Guide video lecture. We're going to be going over the 5 common lit passages that you can expect to see on your short story test on April 3rd. So, quick point of reference, here are your 5 passages. Stereotypes might make female hurricanes deadlier. Eleanor Roosevelt, not without her consent. An obstacle, a jury of her peers, and everyday use. So what I want to point out here is that this is what you should have done. Logged on to Canvas for April 2nd, Short Story Study Guide Spring 2020. This is the standard students only study guide, so it has your 5 passages that you should have read and now completed the study guide for. The study guide is not being collected, it's for your benefit so that you are better prepared for your test on April 3rd. I'm going to tell you how you should have responded to this study guide, and we're also going to briefly go over some tips about what your answers should look like. I'm not going to give you quote unquote correct, 100% accurate copy paste answers. So stereotypes of hurricanes. For each of the passages, I'm asking you to write a statement summarizing each of the following as they are presented. So for stereotypes of hurricanes, introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. I want you to be able to, one, tell me where those parts of the story occur, so what paragraphs are associated with what parts of the story, and then two, be able to summarize that section in 1 to 2 sentences. If you can do that, you'll be able to answer your multiple choice questions tomorrow, and you should be all right. The next thing is purpose. So, what reason did the authors write that particular passage? And then the last thing is theme or main idea. What is the overall message that they are trying to get audiences to buy into or believe? The second passage is everyday use, same thing. Introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Tell me which paragraphs are which parts of the story, and write a 1 to 2 sentence statement summarizing that particular part of the passage. In everyday use, I want you to be able to identify the conflict type, which by that I mean man versus self versus circumstance or versus society. And then I also want you to be able to explain to me what is the theme or main idea of that passage. Passage 3 is going to be a jury of her peers. Again, introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. Identify the paragraphs, write a 1 to 2 sentence summary summarizing that section of the text. Tell me what is the conflict type and what is the theme or main idea of the passage. And then we have passage 4, Eleanor Roosevelt. A little bit different here because this particular passage uses subtitles. So for the first part of that study guide, or for the first part for that passage of the study guide, I want you to tell me why they use study guide subtitles and what was the effect of subtitles. How does it help the reader understand the passage? The second thing, the title of the passage. The title of the passage is Eleanor Roosevelt, Not Without Her Consent. I want you to explain to me how that passage or how that title relates to the overall theme of the passage. Which takes you to question 3, what is the theme or main idea of the passage? And then I've asked you to go ahead and see if you could identify introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution for Eleanor Roosevelt. They still do apply, they still exist, even within the subtitles. But don't think that the subtitles are boundaries and barriers on that one. It is a little bit flexible. And then the last passage is an obstacle. I want you to be able to tell me where the shift in the poem occurs, what types of figurative language are used, what kind of rhyme is used in the poem, what is the theme, and then what is the moral lesson? What are they trying to teach you in this particular poem? Okay, so you have all of these in your short story study guide. I also want to show you one more thing in the modules before we get to the actual common lits. If you scroll down in our modules, you can see the short story notes are in Canvas. We didn't get to go through all of this in class, but I did go back and add all of our passages that we should have read. and I added some notes to the short story note slide. So if you want to take a look at those, it may help you respond to that study guide. It may give you something more to think about in terms of interpreting these texts and answering these questions. So you have that resource available to you as well. Okay. Also, going to put your study guide and your video lectures linked into your notes passage here, as well as just posting them in the distance learning module for this week. So I'll add the video to the module itself as a link, and then it'll be linked here into the study guide. So you'll have multiple ways to get to and access this particular video. All right, so let's go into our common lit passages and let's go through our stories. Let's start with stereotypes might make female hurricanes deadlier. So we read this passage together in class. It's been quite some time, couple, maybe 3 weeks. But stereotypes of hurricanes. This is an informational article that covers how, throughout history, researchers have been studying hurricanes and how deadly they are. Researchers found in their initial research that hurricanes with female names often have more deadly outcomes. It was believed at first that these outcomes were due to the fact that female names led people to feel that the hurricane was in fact feminine and therefore somehow less severe. However, after further examining the facts, it was found that the information of the article was skewed due to the fact that when hurricanes were first named, all of the hurricanes had female names, which could have led to elevated results. So in terms of breaking down the passage, the introduction is paragraph 1, rising action, paragraphs 2 through 4. The climax is paragraph 5, falling action, paragraphs 6 through 9, resolution, paragraphs 10 and 11. The purpose of the text is to inform the audiences and address gender biases. And for the theme or main idea, students should address both the findings of the study and that people perceive female hurricanes as less dangerous due to gender stereotypes. Moving on to Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was the longest serving First Lady of the United States from 1933 to 1945. During this time, her husband Franklin D. Roosevelt's 4 terms as the 32nd President of the United States. She was First Lady during some of the most challenging periods of the 20th century in America, including the Great Depression and World War II. This text discusses her impact on the role of First Lady and the issues that mattered most to her. So this particular passage, as I told you, the use of subtitles is very important. The use of subtitles in this passage allows readers to follow the progression of the article, and it helps to develop the theme by giving the reader more information from different parts of Eleanor's life. The organization of the passage, along with the subtitles, is going to be chronological, so they follow her life as First Lady from the beginning through to the end in order, the way it would have happened in real life. The title of the passage. Eleanor Roosevelt, not without her consent. That line, not without her consent, is going to be repeated later in the passage. So I want you to make some connection there about theme development and foreshadowing. Why incorporate that into the title, and how does it relate to the line when it gets reused later in the passage? Theme and main idea. Eleanor Roosevelt used her role as First Lady to create a positive change by living outside the limitations imposed on women of her time and speaking out forcefully against injustice. This is your theme. So explain to me how that theme gets developed and how you can tell that that's what your theme is. The introduction for this particular passage is paragraph 1, rising action, paragraphs 2 through 4, climax, paragraphs 5 through 7, falling action, paragraphs 8 through 13, resolution, paragraphs 14 and 15. And then we move on to the poem, An Obstacle. The poem by Charlotte Perkins Gilman is about persistence in overcoming obstacles and challenges that we face in our daily lives. The speaker of the poem is climbing a mountain, creating a visual that aligns with the theme of the poem. The speaker makes multiple comparisons throughout the poem to help readers relate to the challenging situation the speaker is facing. Gilman even writes in a sing-song manner, maintaining a rhythm in the poem that flows and adds to the rise and fall, similar to the theme of facing difficulties with ease and some that require more work. The shift in this particular poem I want you to write down is lines 41 and 42. The figurative language used in the poem, there are multiple examples of personification and simile. I'll let you pick those out and choose the lines that you feel are most relevant. For rhyme, I want you to look at this particular stanza right here, and I want to show you the words soar, swore, soar, and before, and those particular lines as they rhyme in the passage, creating the rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern, I should say, A, B, C, B, D, B. Because lines 1, 3, and 5 don't rhyme, 2, 4, and 6 do. In this particular passage, we're going to describe theme as part of that persistence, overcoming obstacles, and resilience. And I want you to be able to tell me how you know that those ideas are the theme and how they're developed. The moral lesson in the poem, it discusses how our problems are only as big as we make them out to be. And this can be seen in the last stanza where, with absent-minded air, and I walked directly through him as if he wasn't there. This particular part of the passage showing you that the speaker was able to just face their problems like it wasn't that big of a deal, and therefore the problem was only as big as they had made it out to be. And then we have the passage, a jury of her peers. Sorry, guys, I've got Jack barking in the background of your video. Everyday use. The author writes the story of a family and two daughters who have differing views on family heritage and heirlooms. Dee is an older woman who has left home and moved far away to start a new and different life. She has now returned home for a visit with her new husband, and she recognizes the family and parts of her old life. But she does not cherish the things in her family the way that Maggie does. Maggie is the younger of the two, who is still at home and very much values and uses the possessions of the family. While Dee tries to convince her mother to give her the possessions so that she might take them and make them part of her home decor and put them up so they're not used and worn down, she criticizes that Maggie would make everyday use of the items. Turns out her mother's very offended by this because in the past, Dee turned down the family heirlooms, saying that they were old-fashioned and out of date, and that was the reason that she didn't want them. Mother claims that she wants Dee to understand that the quilts are precious, but that doesn't mean that they cannot be used. They are a symbol of the family and the hard work that the family is capable of, and that hard work should be acknowledged and should be worth something. So for this particular passage, the introduction, paragraphs 1 through 5, rising action, paragraphs 6 through 24, climax, paragraphs 25 through 51, falling action, paragraphs 52 through 67, resolution, paragraphs 68 through 84. The conflict type in this particular passage is going to be man versus man. And then the theme. Sometimes adopting a new heritage can result in the rejection of a person's true heritage and family history. What you need to be able to go back and do is tell me where you see that theme being developed, how, and why. And then, I'm sorry, I was on the wrong passage. That was for everyday use. Now we're going to talk about a jury of her peers. This passage is a young woman who has killed her husband and the realization of that fact. The county attorney is Mr. Peters, who investigates the death of Mr. Wright, the gentleman who is dead, when Mr. Hale reveals that upon stopping at the Wright home, he found Mrs. Wright in a rocking chair downstairs, and Mr. Wright is upstairs and he is dead from being hung. During the investigation, Mr. Peters took his wife and the wife of Mr. Hale to the home with him so that they could gather some of the personal effects from Mrs. Wright, who is down at the jail being accused of the murder of her husband. It's Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale who discover the truth behind the murder of Mr. Wright. When they're looking for some of her personal effects, they find a dead bird, and the dead bird has a broken neck to it. Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters put it together that Mr. Wright must have not liked the bird and therefore killed it. And when he killed the bird, Mrs. Wright then turned and killed him. Mr. Peters' statements when he keeps coming in and out of the room, questioning his wife about what she's found, and he's talking about his own investigation and what he thinks may have happened, are a little bit ironic because he's not really understanding what would have happened here and the motives about how this gentleman may have died. Mrs. Peter and Mrs. Hale kind of keep to themselves and don't tell Mr. Peters, the investigator, county attorney, what they found, but the reader's able to compare and contrast what Mrs. Peter and Mrs. Hale find with what Mr. Peters is saying. So the introduction of this particular passage is going to be paragraphs 1 through 5, the rising action, paragraphs 6 through 151, climax, paragraphs 152 through 230, falling action, paragraph 231 through 274, and then resolution, paragraphs 275 through 295. The conflict type, man versus man, or it could be man versus self. It depends on if you feel that Miss Peters and Mrs. Hale are in direct opposition of Mr. Peters, or whether or not Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale are fighting themselves about keeping the truth from the men. And then theme or main idea for this particular passage. I don't have my notes on that one. I'm sorry, guys. I think it's truth. I think this one's going to be an idea of truth and the truth coming out despite how hard you try to hide it. The truth will always come to the light. So that's it. Again, I apologize. I was talking about the poem Everyday Use before this, but I was on the page for A Jury of Her Peers. I didn't scroll through anything in particular, so all you heard was my voiceover. There's your lecture notes. You guys have your study guide. Please make sure that that gets completed. You have your notes available to you in Canvas as well. And good luck on your test on Friday, April 3rd.